sorry, but I'm just getting to the point where I feel like I can't even keep up with the news anymore because so much shit is out of control. Like, have you been watching what's been going on for the last week on college campuses? We talked about some of the pro-Palestinian protests earlier this week, or maybe it was Friday, I can't remember. But like shit's out of control, especially at Columbia University. I guess protesters were like camped out for days and over 100 people got arrested last Thursday. And like once again, we're in this situation where we have Jewish students being physically threatened and intimidated. You've got protesters shouting things like, "We are Hamas, long live Hamas, there's only one solution." And then I saw a video where a guy was saying, like, "Never forget the 7th of October. That will not happen one more time, not 5 times, not 10 times, not 100 more times, not 1,000 times, but 10,000 times." Like, what the fuck? And then one story I read was like this Jewish student that the protesters told him like he needed to kill himself while they were beating him and like kicking him in the stomach, and they're calling for the death of Netanyahu. And it's like, I'm sorry, but these people are completely unhinged and it's fucking scary.
It is. I mean, as a parent with a daughter in high school, there's no fucking way I would send her to an Ivy League school if she qualified. Like, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out because you have to be crazy to send your kid to one of these like woke college campuses. Yeah, the news has been, I have been not in a good like mental health state in the past few days because
Yeah.
it's like there's just all kinds of stuff going on and it really makes me mad. So the arrests that they did at Columbia didn't really seem to have that much of an effect because the protests began ramping up even more, like ahead of Passover, which was Monday, to the point where Columbia canceled in-person classes. Like you're spending all this money sending your kid to school and they cancel classes. Like it's insane. And so one of the rabbis that's associated with the school told Jewish students to leave the campus for their safety until tensions ease. And this was according to the Independent. And I want to play a clip that I found from Michael Gerber, who's the NYPD Deputy Commissioner of Legal Matters. And he was giving a press conference about the protests and like what the NYPD is doing in response. So take a listen to his response.
We cannot just go on the Columbia campus as we see fit. It is up to the university to decide whether or not they want us on campus. As a general matter, Columbia University, and this goes back many years, does not want NYPD present on campus. That is their decision. Last week, on Thursday, they informed us they had students who were trespassing. They asked us to come on the campus to take action, and we did. But that was an exceptional case. In the normal course, they've made clear that we will not be there, and so we're not there. We cannot just.
Tara, as an ex-police officer, I'm sure like you've been there where it's like you want to do something, the community's like looking at you like, why don't you do something? But your hands are tied, and you can't.
Yeah,
So,
I think most major colleges and universities have their own police force or some
yeah,
kind of security detail at least.
yeah. It's just crazy, like how far things have to go before the college will, have police get involved. Um, so the thing is, like, obviously, I'm all for freedom of speech. I know you are. Like, that's the whole point of this podcast. And I really do think we should protect it, even when I don't agree with the speech, because I want to be able to have the freedom to say the things that the left may not agree with. But what bothers me about these college protesters is that they're the same people that, try to get people in trouble for not using their self-identified pronouns and like think that the majority of the public has to change their speech just to make them comfortable. But then they turn around and make death threats to Jewish students and chant death to America. And they think that that's okay and there shouldn't be any repercussions. Like, that's the part that pisses me off. And it's like, if the college campuses are going to put up with this hate speech, Well, then they better also put up with speech that they don't agree with from the right, including people using correct grammatical, pronouns without any repercussion. And like, I don't mean to get us derailed on the whole pronoun thing, but I do think it's a valid point that I really don't see anyone like pointing out. It's these lefty elitists in the academia world that don't want to listen to any speech that they disagree with, but then they want to have the right to protest flat out hate speech, anti-Semitism, and they think that that's like perfectly okay. So there is another clip that I want to play, and this is of a Jewish professor at Columbia, and he was actually denied access to the campus without any notice from the school. He found out as he's walking up to try to get in. So listen to this.
Okay, I'm walking with Professor Shai Davidai right outside the gate of Columbia University's campus. He's going to try to enter campus. He has his Columbia University ID. He's trying to enter. Oh, I'm sorry, Shai.
Right, 1 second. I want to get this on video that they have deactivated. This is the sound. This is the sound of civil rights being denied of a Jewish professor. I want you all to remember this sign.
Did you?
Okay, I didn't realize how annoying that was, but that noise, that loud, piercing noise was his ID, like not working. And it's saying that he can't enter. And so he was saying, I want everyone to hear this sound because this is like civil rights being destroyed right here. That, he works for Columbia. He is a professor there. He, is someone who's been very active in the community, and he can't enter his own school. And the school didn't even bother to tell him they were deactivating his card just because he's Jewish. Like,
Wow.
How insane is that? So now you have billionaire donors like Robert Kraft and Leon Cooperman that are not going to support Columbia further until the administration takes harsher action against the protests. So I guess they've donated hundreds of millions of dollars in the past, and they're like, what the hell? Like, we're not giving you anything until you fix this problem. And then you have...
Okay, I'm sorry. Didn't they learn from the protests months ago at like Harvard and like...
Right.
We've already been through this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, that's the thing. They never learn their lesson ever, and they just cower down to the mob. And you have the same thing going on at Yale University. It's like all these Ivy League schools. So you have 45 people who were arrested at Yale during a protest where they were calling on the university to divest from corporations that were complicit in genocide. And a Jewish student journalist was jabbed in the eye by a protester that was carrying a Palestinian flag. She went on Fox News and was explaining her story. And she said she was asking for help. And the protesters around her were laughing at her when she said she was stabbed. Laughing at her, not helping her whatsoever. And they basically like made room so the guy could get away so that he wouldn't get in trouble. And then I watched another video, and this was so sad, Tara. It was this Jewish student, and he was just walking on campus, trying to get back to, I guess, his dorm or wherever he lived. And the mob approached him, encircled him, and wouldn't let him walk freely on campus. And they're yelling all these slurs. And it's just like so hard to watch because it's one guy by himself. And we're talking about like dozens of people surrounding him. And he was obviously very nervous. And he just kind of like laughed, like he was trying to like diffuse the situation. He's like, hey guys, I'm just walking. I'm just walking. That's all I'm doing. I'm just walking. And they wouldn't let him. They wouldn't let him go any further. And it's just crazy to me. I think like after the Holocaust, which we've all learned about in school, which was not that long ago, I cannot believe that this kind of behavior is being allowed. I can't believe it's happening at all. And like just last week, you had the head of Columbia. I think her name is Nihat Shafiq. She went in front of Congress and she was, actually answering questions the way you should, unlike the previous leaders of universities. So at least she did learn from that. And, she's telling Elise Stefanik that she's not going to tolerate anti-Semitism at her school. And like there's going to be repercussions. That was last week. And then this week, you have this like very clear anti-Semitic and downright dangerous speech, and nothing's really happening. She's not doing anything about it. And this is the other part that pisses me off. We all know that if these were MAGA protesters or Christian protesters, the NYPD would be called and it would be broken up immediately. Immediately. They would be thrown off campus if there were even the slightest hint of hate speech or threats. And yet this has been going on. I mean, it's an encampment. They literally have an encampment set up at this university. And like, imagine being a Jewish parent who's spending $300,000 a year on this Ivy League school, and your kid can't even walk safely on their own campus. Are you kidding me? It's this is so wrong. So wrong.
And you mentioned that rabbi earlier that is calling for students to leave campus. Well, the students have agreed, and like they're all trying to finish the semester online because the school is totally unwilling and unable to guarantee their safety. And I want to play this clip from Hannity from his show on Wednesday, if it'll play.
Towards the pro-Hamas crowd, they're now running the show. They have taken over a big part of the university. Dissent no longer safe at an Ivy League institution. Now, the base of the Democratic Party, they have gone from self-proclaimed, open-minded, peace-loving hippies to radical terrorist sympathizers. You know, the very people that would get triggered if you use the wrong pronoun. Now they are justifying violence and really offering what is nothing short of aid and comfort to terrorists. Now, to his credit, there is one Democrat, only one, and that's John Fetterman, of all people, calling these protests reprehensible and demanding Columbia's president step down. Now, Senator Tim Scott, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, and several other Republican lawmakers, they have also called for Columbia's president to resign. She should be fired before she resigns. New York Times, well, they're describing the protest as one big happy party. Quote, at Columbia, the protest continued with dancing and pizza. That's just like the summer of 2020, 574 mostly peaceful riots. Remember, dozens of dead Americans, cops pelted with bricks, rocks, bottles, Molotov cocktails, and billions in property damage, mostly peaceful. Why? Because they wanted that vote. I guess they missed the calls for a global intifada across our country. Similar protests, by the way, were happening in Yale, MIT, as you can see on your screen, NYU. Far-left, radicalized students indoctrinated by their communist professors taking to the streets to call for what? The annihilation of Israel and the United States from the river to the sea? And the Columbia president thinks that's okay?
He goes on. Like, did you hear that? Did you hear the clip? Was it clear?
Yeah, you cut out for 1 second, but I think it was like a service issue. But yeah, I heard it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And
like,
Tara, like, I'm just thinking too, when I was in high school, and it was probably the same thing for you as well. There was like this group of kids, we called them like the skinheads or whatever. And they were like anti-Semitic for sure. They were all expelled immediately just for wearing something that like represented Nazis or something like that. They were all expelled immediately. Like it was not tolerated. And so I'm just so baffled seeing how this is not only tolerated, they're like celebrating it. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, and it's disgusting. And it's like, you know, you mentioned earlier your thoughts on protecting freedom of speech. And obviously, I'm very passionate about free speech. And like you said, that's the basis of our platform and why we started this podcast. And I agree that people have a right to protest and have their voice heard. But I also think there's a very clear difference between freedom of speech and hate speech that puts people in physical danger and even like emotional and mental turmoil that these poor Jewish students are going through, especially when you consider the impact of the mob mentality. And like, that's exactly what's happening with these protests. And the mob mentality is what escalated the Holocaust. And the only major difference at this point in my mind is that the anti-Jewish sentiment isn't coming directly from the government. It's coming from the people. But then I question that because the White House, okay, so I think it was Monday, they actually gave a statement, which to be honest, surprised me because it was fairly direct. So White House Press Secretary Andrew Bates told the Washington Examiner, quote, while every American has the right to peaceful protest, calls for violence and physical intimidation targeting Jewish students and the Jewish community are blatantly anti-Semitic, unconscionable, and dangerous. They have absolutely no place on any college campus or anywhere in the United States of America. And echoing the rhetoric of terrorist organizations, especially in the wake of the worst massacre committed against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, is despicable. We condemn these statements in the strongest terms, end quote. Okay, so that sounds good, right? Like, I agree with that. Yet at the same time, we know our government is simultaneously supporting Israel and Palestine, Iran. We have members of Congress who are openly pro-Hamas and clearly in support of Jewish genocide. One of the protesters at Columbia was Rep. Ilhan Omar's daughter. And after like stuff started coming out on the news about the protest, she made a comment that she was extremely proud of her daughter for, quote, pushing her school to stand against genocide, end quote. But what's not being said here is maybe they're standing against genocide of the people in Gaza, but they're simultaneously advocating for the genocide of Jews in our own country. And then after the White House gives this official press statement on Monday, on Tuesday, Biden gets hit up by reporters at an Earth Day event, and he's asked to comment on everything that's been going on. And first off, let me set the scene here because it's Biden standing in the woods looking as confused as ever. So this one reporter asks, she says, do you condemn the anti-Semitic protests on college campuses? And Biden's like already starting to walk away, right? And his response is, quote, I condemn the anti-Semitic protests. That's why I have set up a program to deal with that. I also condemn those who don't understand what's going on with the Palestinians and how they're being, and then his voice like trails off and he starts to wander away. So the reporter like immediately jumps in again and she asks if the Columbia University president should resign. And Biden's response is, quote, I didn't know that. I'll have to find out more about that, end quote. And at the same time, obviously his handlers are trying to shut him up and get him out of there as soon as possible, because while he's talking, you can hear one of them in the background saying, right this way, Mr. President. Like, Stephanie, is there ever a comment from this man where he says something that makes any sense? No. And once again, I want to point out that we have Biden taking credit for shit that he's not even doing. He says, quote, I set up a program to deal with that. No, old man, you didn't do a fucking thing except expose your hypocritical true colors once again by pandering to the left and essentially supporting anti-Semitism. So journalists and commentators are having a field day with this, obviously. And I think one of the best comments I heard was from former Congressman Joe Walsh. And he said, quote, bad, weak, cowardly answer. Know the time and place. Right now, Jewish students are being harassed and threatened on college campuses. Just condemn that. Have the courage right now not to, quote, both sides the issue and condemn only what's happening to Jewish students. And he didn't, end quote.
Yeah.
And I agree with that.
I know they never give a straight answer. It's always got to be this like wishy-washy thing. And it's weakness. It's not leadership. And it's aggravating. It's aggravating and it's unacceptable. And he's going to lose the election because of this.
Yeah. And I guess we'll see what happens and how much longer this shit goes on. But I just don't like, it's just unfathomable to me that this shit is happening in our country. Like, I repeat that every time we talk about it, but it just blows my fucking mind.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's switch gears. Let's move on from protests to plandemics, because I want to give, and then we're going to lighten it up a little bit too right now, because that was pretty heavy. So I want to give a little update on the bird flu issue, because honestly, it doesn't seem to be going away. And I was going to bring this up last week, but we just have had so much shit to talk about that we didn't cover it. But if you haven't been paying attention, like, the cases are spreading. You've got more and more cattle developing bird flu. There are 32 separate cases now reported in 8 states. The USDA has confirmed there are 12 infected dairy cattle herds in Texas, 4 in Kansas, 6 each in New Mexico and Michigan, and 1 each in Idaho, North Carolina, Ohio, and South Dakota. Now, there haven't been confirmed cases in beef cattle yet, reportedly, but at the same time, a few weeks ago, there weren't any cases in dairy cattle either. So who's to say that's not going to happen? Bird flu has made its way to the parks of New York City. You have multiple species of birds, including chickens, hawks, falcons, and geese, that have all tested positive for bird flu in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. So this is not just being, in rural areas, it's spreading out to the cities and the urban environment. Maryland recently announced they're taking preventative action by issuing an order restricting the movement of dairy cows from other states that have been affected. And now we talked about the animals that have died in Antarctica. Well, now there's a new report that surfaced that bird flu may be responsible for killing thousands of penguins in Antarctica. And then aside from the wildlife crisis, last week we have scientists saying there's no cause for alarm for humans. We don't need to worry until the virus jumps to pigs. Okay, but surprise, surprise, the CDC announced last week that they just happen to have some candidate vaccines waiting in the wings should the virus start spreading to humans. In fact, according to a Yahoo News article from this Monday, the U.S. federal government has a stockpile of enough doses to vaccinate 1/5 of the American population. But these doses are still undergoing clinical testing. I don't know about you, Stephanie, but this sounds like another shady COVID-style vaccine. Like we didn't see that coming, right?
Not surprised at all.
And what's interesting is we're getting different information from the World Health Organization. So they're saying vaccine development is nowhere near where it needs to be. And last Thursday, the WHO put out a warning that the ongoing spread of bird flu in mammals and birds around the world is a, quote, significant public health concern, end quote, because not only is it spreading from birds to cows, but it's also spreading from cows back to birds. And then those birds fly all over the world, and it's like finding routes of transmission that scientists haven't previously seen. And then on Friday, the WHO announces that, oh yes, the virus is found in raw milk, which we already knew. So while the risk to humans is still relatively low, the concern, obviously, is that the virus appears to be looking for new hosts, as there have been confirmed cases in cattle, goats, dogs, and cats, and it's obviously spreading to different animals. And as it does that, the virus becomes more likely to spread to humans. And then also of concern, I was reading in the Jerusalem Post, they're reporting that U.S. officials have not been transparent or clear enough about the actual number of outbreaks of bird flu in America. Last Friday, bird flu was detected in a cattle herd in North Carolina, and the USDA did not publicly share any of this information, presumably because the cattle weren't showing symptoms. So now there's concern that the disease is even more widespread than we know because of the symptomless cattle. And so the director of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, his name is Michael Osterholm, he says that the behavior of U.S. officials concerning this outbreak has created the perception that something is happening or not happening that would not meet with the public's approval. That sounds a little cryptic. Not sure what that means, but this past Sunday, I guess there was enough pressure and criticism from scientists that the USDA released 239 samples of bird flu that they've taken from various animals, including chickens, dairy cattle, birds, and now also a raccoon and a skunk. And so to what I mentioned earlier about the pigs, reportedly federal officials aren't actively monitoring infections in pigs, even though pigs are often kept on farms right next to cattle. So why aren't they checking the pigs if that's the fastest route of transmission to humans? So even though this doesn't seem to be an impending pandemic killing off millions of human beings, the impact that it's having on wildlife and our food supply is something that certainly raises red flags for me. And Stephanie, tell me if you think this is a coincidence, because you know how we both feel about coincidences. So just last week, the White House announced a new global health security strategy where America is going to be working with 50 other countries on what they're calling a global health partnership. If you want to see, go on wh.gov. There's a document, there's a fact sheet, it lays it all out. And then have you heard about the World Bank Pandemic Fund? Also recent. This was instituted 2 months ago on February 22nd. And you can go on their website and you can look it up as well. But it's also about a global, like, pandemic health agreement. Now, I don't trust the CDC or the WHO for shit. And as I said earlier, I think this is another attempt at a plandemic, but they sure are putting a lot of fucking effort into this.
Yeah, well, you know me, I had to go down the rabbit hole with this one. And you're 100% correct. I have no doubt in my mind. And I mean, even Bill Gates has warned us, and they've said out loud, like 2025 will be the next pandemic. Well, how do they know that? How do they know unless they're planning it, right? So this quite literally is a plandemic, in my opinion, as the US and other countries are signing an agreement with the World Health Organization. Okay. But the scary part of this has not been signed yet, but it will be soon. So, according to the World Health Organization, right on their website, they plan on resuming negotiations with member states and finalizing this agreement April 29th to May 10th. So, right around the corner. And Biden already said he's signing it. Like, he's 100% on board. So, what's in it? Well, number one, the World Health Organization and any member state can decide that there's a public health emergency. But it's so vague, there's no limit to what could be considered a health emergency. They could say climate change is a health emergency. Like, at any point in time, they could decide that there's just this massive public health emergency, right? And it sure as hell could be this bird flu. Absolutely. So once they declare the health emergency, well, then they will have the power to mandate remedies. And this includes vaccines, gene therapy technology. They can dictate travel limitations. They could forbid the use of other medications for treatment, like ivermectin, for example. And they can also censor people. And guess what? It doesn't matter what our Constitution says. It doesn't matter because the Bill of Rights, as well as global human rights, it goes out the window. And this takes precedent. That is what our president is about to sign. So basically, the World Health Organization will control the world. And there you go. There is our one world order. And if you think I'm just being a silly conspiracy theorist, an article was published in The Lancet, which is a medical journal, and I'm just going to read a part of it. So the article states, quote, "Success will require clear demarcations of responsibility with a parsimonious role for international institutions. Although a pandemic treaty or alternative new instrument or process cannot solve all that is wrong with global health, it can deliver targeted improvements if supported by effective and clear global governance." Okay, so how much clearer can they be when they say clear global governance? So Tara, like for me, this confirmed it all. Like we've been right all along about the global elitists that want to literally control the world. And here is proof of it.
Yeah. And like you said, they have been telling us that the next pandemic is coming. And so if you take a look at bird flu, it's something that they're stressing is affecting the entire world, right? This isn't confined to America. It's affecting the entire world. But here's something that I do want to talk about, because ever since we started seeing media coverage of these rising cases and how the jump from birds to mammals was never talked about up until recently, even though studies show that this has been happening in Antarctica for some time. And bird flu has been around. It's not a new virus. It's been around for a few years. But notice it did not become mainstream news until it started to impact cattle herds in Texas. So I'm going to go down the rabbit hole right now of a conspiracy theory that this is my conspiracy theory, not something that I've read, but from everything I've read, this is what I think. And to me, this is all very suspicious. So first, we have these massive fires a couple months ago, right? And these fires, just in Texas, they destroyed more than 1 million acres of Texas farmland. If you guys remember, the Smokehouse Creek fire was declared the largest wildfire in state history. I was reading an article that came out a couple weeks ago in the Washington Examiner, and it was talking about how the fires were concentrated in an area where 85% of the state's cattle population is, including both beef and dairy cows. So over 7,000 head of cattle were lost in the fire, but that number doesn't include all the cows that had to be euthanized due to their injuries. It's just the ones that were like burned up in the fire. So the number is actually a lot higher. Now, in addition to losing cattle, farmers and ranchers obviously lost farmland, grazing land. I read they lost cotton crops. 7 grain and seed dealers were completely wiped out of business. Thousands of miles of fencing and homes and barns that had been in families and ranches for generations were incinerated. And I saw on a CBS News article that there was like 120 miles of power lines that were destroyed. And so the article I read was also talking about how the top commodity that comes out of Texas is the beef cattle industry, which accounted for over $15.5 billion in market value in 2022. So losing beef cattle is obviously a huge loss for the state of Texas. So then what happens? A few weeks after the fires, we have dairy cows starting to test positive for bird flu, which means farmers with infected animals are prohibited from selling milk. So now we're down beef cattle, and now we're having an impact on dairy cows, right? And then there's the chickens. We already talked a couple weeks ago about how Cal-Maine Foods had to depopulate 1.6 million laying hens and 337,000 pullets from just their Texas facility. And guess what? Poultry, eggs, and the dairy industry are the second and third top commodities in Texas, right behind beef cattle. That same article I mentioned from the Washington Examiner reported that poultry and eggs accounted for $5 billion and dairy accounted for $3.5 billion market value in 2022. So that means farmers and ranchers can't sell eggs or chickens either. Okay, and now let's look at impact number 3. There's the ongoing border crisis, right? So we have the fires, the bird flu, and the border crisis. So my conspiracy brain is like, there's something purposefully nefarious going on here. Like, I don't think the fires were an accident. The bird flu starting in cattle in Texas, is that an accident? The border crisis is clearly not a fucking accident. So either God has it out for Texas, or there's some kind of plot by the elites to destroy one of the strongest states in the country by slowly killing their economy, while at the same time impacting the country's food supply in the process, right? And like, Stephanie, we've talked about this many times, but what's the best way to cripple a population is you fuck with their food supply. So even if bird flu right now isn't harmful to humans at this point, it's very clear that they're trying to push this as the next plandemic and use the bird flu as, even if it doesn't end up being a pandemic, I can see them using it to go along with the climate change narrative of getting rid of, cows and farming and getting rid of meat. And this is all in alignment with the elite's plan. So, I mean, I know I sound crazy, but what do you think?
You don't sound crazy at all. I thought this the second the wildfires started, and it just made me think too. I can't even remember if we talked about this, but there is video footage, and it's from oh shoot, what's the news outlet? Not the news outlet, but they record everything. C-SPAN. It was a C-SPAN video of the State of the Union right before, like, when Biden was walking out and like greeting everybody. And he's talking to one of the congressmen, and he says, yeah, I was in Texas. We got in a helicopter and all of the houses were burned except the ones with the special roof. And the guy like nodded, like, yeah, like they were all like in on something. And that video was going around for a while. I don't think we ended up talking about it, but it just confirmed. I agree with you. I absolutely think that Texas is a target. We know that the Biden administration isn't happy with Texas because of the whole border thing and how they're fighting back. And I mean, Texas really single-handedly made the whole country aware of the border crisis by shipping the migrants. So that did not bode well for the government. Like, they're not happy with Texas. And just look for patterns, right? Like, how many times does something need to happen for people to realize it isn't just a coincidence, it's a pattern? And like you said, there has been incident after incident going on in Texas. And I don't remember what podcast I was listening to the other day, but this guy who's in the food industry was explaining how it is not profitable or not very profitable for companies to produce meat. It's expensive. It's way more profitable to create these fake meat products that are made with soy because it's just so cheap to make, unlike dealing with livestock. And so he was saying behind the scenes, there's this whole push for getting rid of meat products, but it has nothing to do with being vegan or like cow farts affecting climate change. It's all about the money. It all boils down to making a profit. And what's alarming, like you were saying, they're destroying our food security all in the name of profits. And at least that's what it appears is happening. And of course, these soy products are linked to cancer and a host of other issues. But again, they would want that because that means more profit in pharmaceuticals, in the healthcare industries. And it's just like, to me, it's so obvious what's happening. And I just want to know, like, everyone listening out there, if it's obvious to you as well, like, do we sound crazy or not? Because you have to admit there is a pattern here. And when you laid it out like that they're getting rid of the top three most, profitable or the biggest revenue for Texas, like, that has to mean something, right?
Yeah. I mean,
And
that's what I think.
and it's like, we had the wildfires, the bird flu, but what comes to my mind too is it was in Texas where 40,000 cattle were burned alive. What was that, last year or the year before?
Mhm.
So it's like, these things don't just happen. Like, you never
Right.
heard about this until recently. So there's definitely something going on. And yeah, it's pretty scary because that's our food supply they're messing with.
Yep. So
Well,
food for thought, everybody.
if anything else happens in Texas, we're going to be talking about it. All right. Well, hopefully that gives everyone something to think about this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you back here on Friday.